Well, for years, some of America's most respected and prestigious schools have employed radical professors, some of whom have even attacked America. From domestic terrorist Bill Ayers to his wife Bernadine Dorn, who was once on the FBI's most wanted list, and fellow members of their weather underground like Kathy Wilkerson and Kathy Boudin. Boudin spent 20 years in prison for killing a cop. To folks who are self-described anarchists. These are some of the people molding the minds of students across this nation. Teachers like these are rarely challenged in public. Until tonight, as we bring you night 2 of my exclusive interview with former Professor Ward Churchill. As the U.S. weighs what to do about ISIS, a growing terror army in the Middle East, many fear if we hit this group hard, it will only endanger America and her citizens. Within this collection, there's a far-left subset that blames these conflicts on American foreign policy, on what they view as an arrogant U.S., whose military is so immoral, the terrorists can never even the score. Chief among this crowd, Ward Churchill, who for decades was on the inside of America's educational system, a respected, tenured professor at the University of Colorado. On the day of the 9/11 attacks, he penned an essay praising the terrorists as gallant and courageous and compared the dead Americans to a Nazi war criminal.
I called a specific cast of characters in the World Trade Center, little Eichmanns. And I defined them as being the technocratic core of empire.
For years, his essay was either not noticed or not a problem for those within his academic circles. So much so that 2 years later, the professor doubled down, turning his musings into a book. Then came 2005 and an invitation to speak at a college in upstate New York, the home state of 9/11's ground zero. And Professor Churchill's essay suddenly took center stage.
I mean, this is just cruel to say these people deserved it. They were little Nazis.
The national media caught wind of Churchill's writings, and within 2 years, Churchill's career was effectively over. He was allegedly fired for academic misconduct. The university claimed it had discovered fraud in Churchill's research, but Churchill argued he was fired for his comments, a violation of his free speech rights. A jury sided with Churchill, but the verdict was overturned. And now, as America marks 13 years since the 9/11 attacks, Churchill has resurfaced, calling America the evil empire, and arguing in the war on terror, the U.S. has ceded the moral high ground. Before we show you part 2 of our interview, some highlights from part 1. How could you draw a moral equivalence between 3,000 dead Americans and a murderous Nazi like Adolf Eichmann?
Well, first off, I did not make a reference to 3,000 Americans in that connection. I made a reference to what I described as a technocratic core of empire, which was a particular group within that 3,000.
The folks in the Twin Towers.
Twin Towers, there was also a body count at the Pentagon that day.
Let's talk about the little Eichmann's reference, because that's one of the pieces of what you wrote that got people so upset. Adolf Eichmann, you described him as a technocrat within the Nazi army.
Bureaucrat would work too.
A paper pusher, as far as you're concerned.
Essentially, that's correct.
He, the viewers should know, actually escaped after the war and took refuge in Argentina under a different name, before he was ultimately captured by the Mossad, the Israeli forces, and put to death, the only man in the history of Israel to be put to death by execution. But what he said while he was in hiding in Argentina is as follows. Number 1, he said, quote, "You know, I called my men into my Berlin office and formally took leave of them. If it has to be, I told them, I will gladly jump into my grave in the knowledge that 5 million enemies of the Reich have already died like animals." Doesn't sound like a paper pusher. On the other hand, you know, you thought that the dead Americans were just like the Nazis. However, you had nothing but praise for the 9/11 hijackers. You called them courageous, even gallant. Gallant? Al-Qaeda? The guys who flew those jets into the Twin Trade Centers.
Yeah, now if you ask me, do I actually believe that, or do I believe that I'm still making the point? This is what it feels like. When people who are sitting at computer consoles 1,500 miles away firing cruise missiles into your cities are called heroes.
You understand that Al-Qaeda routinely kills civilians. This group, ISIS, routinely kills civilians.
Are you
and
asking
that's
me
the
if
purpose.
I am a supporter of Al-Qaeda?
You certainly sound like you like them.
No, I
They're
sound like
courageous.
a Pentagon briefer
They have
doing
the
a
courage
record
of their
in reverse
convictions.
is exactly what
They're
I sound
gallant.
like.
And then you yourself poured salt in the wounds of the victims of 9/11 and their families. So how can you claim the moral high ground when it comes to causing pain, causing destruction, when you, at the most vulnerable moment, did the very same thing to them?
Which is exactly the point again. This is done day in, day out,
You're pointing to somebody else. Will you apologize to anyone?
And tonight, former University of Colorado professor Ward Churchill answers that question in part 2 of our interview.
Will you apologize to anyone?
I will not apologize. When I hear an apology for the 500,000-odd Iraqi children, then I'll take it under consideration. As to the American children who were killed, I mourn them. I mourn them proportionally, just as much as I mourn any given one of those Iraqi children.
Proportionately, that's interesting. You spent your life working for the government you hate. A little hypocritical?
I used it for the exact purpose that you're hearing now, which is try to explain things. That was the job.
How about ISIS? Are they evil?
Sure they are.
Do you think that
they're not Christians, so I can't really speak for Islam in terms of the concept of evil, but...
But you describe the Al-Qaeda terrorists as brave. Do you believe that ISIS terrorists are brave?
Let me try this one more time and see if you get it this time. I was writing in directly the voice of a Pentagon briefer, only I'm running the record in reverse. Now, I don't know exactly how you want me to take responsibility for what I did, more than state exactly what it was I did.
I'm just asking you the question. Do you believe ISIS is brave and courageous and restrained?
As brave and courageous and restrained as any of the American forces that are described as brave, courageous,
Can you answer
and
yes or no?
restrained. Exactly the same. I don't find either of them especially redeeming. You don't find me joining a particular formation, a fundamentalist formation. I'm not especially enthralled with fundamentalism of any sort.
So we have no moral high ground when it comes to America versus ISIS.
I've seen American moral high ground at work in Southeast Asia, thank you very much. And the answer to that would be an absolute no.
Okay, we don't. So
we don't.
What should we do? Should we let them just commit these atrocities with impunity? Should we let them go on beheading Christians, beheading children, committing crucifixions?
I have heard one good suggestion on this of what we could do to maybe alleviate the situation would be stop killing their babies.
Okay, so it's back on us. If we want ISIS to stop killing Christians...
Take some responsibility, as you put it, and all the rest of it.
How far should we take that, Professor? Should we let them come here to the homeland? Do we get to defend ourselves if they try to bomb us?
Whose homeland is this?
Is it yours, sir? Are we back on that again?
I don't know. Is it?
You tell me, Professor.
How did this get to be this homeland?
Okay, so we're back to that. The genocide against Native Americans justifies every bad thing that ever happens to the United States ever after.
I'm not quite sure that you're putting words in my mouth would necessarily be an answer to the question. But how exactly did this homeland come to be the homeland?
Why do you live here? If you hate America so much, why have you chosen to stay here?
It's my country. It's also my homeland.
But why stay if you hate it?
I heard you sort of scoff and dismiss the genocide of American Indians.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
No, we're at that. And you're the one that was just like scoffing at the idea that there might be some implication, the idea that you exterminate entire populations of people in order to claim this homeland that needs defending.
Well, the problem I have with your position on Native Americans, and I will tell you this, is that you've been found to be a dishonest broker. Repeatedly. Really? You have. And I don't know anything about you, Professor. I've just researched you. And what I have found is that you've been accused of grossly overstating and in some cases inventing these atrocities of which you speak. And I'll give the viewers the examples. First of all, this is the investigative committee that came after you at the University of Colorado Boulder. The investigative committee came out and said, quote, Churchill has created myths under the banner of academic scholarship. They found a, quote, pattern of deliberate academic misconduct involving falsification and fabrication, specifically with respect to your claims about the Native Americans. Go ahead.
Well, it might be of interest to you to know that that committee, on the basis of that report, and their mustering of so-called factual data were found to have been engaged in myth-making of the first degree, guilty of everything they accused me of, to the extent that they had to be immunized from the consequences of their action by the administration of the University of Colorado. And that a panel of scholars, University of Colorado, went through point by point in exhaustive detail and produced a report for the AAUP, which is posted online for Journal of Academic Freedom, that found that there was no validity to any of the findings of that investigative report.
All right.
Plus, there is a jury in Denver, Colorado, which concluded, having been told repeatedly that me having been actually guilty of any of the offenses that are delineated in the investigative report, any one would have been sufficient grounds for firing, and the jury determined that they had no grounds for firing on that basis at all.
The jury believed, just so the viewers understand, the jury believed that the university was using your alleged academic misconduct as a ruse to fire you for your comments about 9/11. That's what the jury concluded. They did not say that the conclusions about your academic misconduct were fair or unfair. That's the truth. Hold on, but because there's a second point, and that is it wasn't just the investigative committee, as you know. Several historians have come out and said you've misrepresented the facts. A UCLA professor who is a member of the Cherokee Nation and two others refuted your assertions that were based on their works. They called it, quote, an out-and-out fabrication that the Westerners infected the Indians with smallpox based on giving them all these blankets. You claim up to 400,000 Native Americans were killed. They said, quote, it's just the making up of data, and it shouldn't be tolerated in science. Number two, Professor Thomas Brown of Lamar University, quote, every aspect of Churchill's tale is fabricated. Churchill has fabricated incidents that never occurred and individuals who never existed. He falsified the sources that he cited in support of his tale and repeatedly concealed evidence in his possession that disconfirms his version of events. These are the guys on whose work your claims were based. And third, Cherokee sociologist Russell Thornton wrote to the LA Times and to Inside Higher Ed, the history is bad enough, there's no need to embellish it. He thinks you were inflating the numbers unfairly. He went on to say, he blatantly misrepresented me. It was totally inappropriate. I'm his source for this allegation, and it's wrong. It's academic fraud sustained over several essays. So they're all lying about Ward Churchill?
You probably should know what you're talking about before you talk national TV, Megyn.
Once again, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Number one, the Cherokee...
I'm glad I have you here to explain it to me.
Yeah, that's Thomas Brown, and Thomas Brown was fired from Lamar University. He hasn't been a professor in the league.
And you were fired, too, for academic misconduct,
Thomas
sir.
Brown
it's
was
tough to claim that moral high ground.
If you're going to suggest that discredits me, you should be accepting that that's discrediting Thomas Brown, who's now working out of an abandoned grocery store in San Antonio. So what can I tell you?
A lot of people tell lies about you. A lot of them. Long list.
Yeah. I have to say that there's probably a lot of people who tell lies about you out there, too.
Okay.
Or at least what you would view as lies, but they don't tend to get parsed by academic committees, and there's a rather large number that could be cited.
If you stay tuned for nothing else, watch the next segment. In it, we lay bare the fallacy of his claims about the Twin Towers on 9/11. And at last, his answer to whether the U.S. should be bombed again. What the earlier part of our exchange with Ward Churchill proves is that the professor has a tendency to play fast and loose with the facts. What this next segment proves is that he makes them up entirely, especially when it comes to the subject of 9/11. Your justification, you're one of the many you've offered for the reason the terrorists had the right to bomb the World Trade Center. You've said repeatedly it's because the CIA had offices there, and that made it fair game for a military strike, for a strike by terrorists.
According to Pentagon rules. I don't think that's true, and I've made this point repeatedly in things I've written, too. That's not true in international law, but the Pentagon invokes that continuously.
Okay, but you realize that those CIA offices, A, were covert and were not known by anybody prior to the actual bombing, and B, those offices were in World Trade Center 7. That was not attacked by the terrorists. It fell down due to burning debris.
Well, we are parsing again. I don't know what they knew and what they didn't know. I didn't even know who they were. So what your inroads are into the intelligence apparatus of Al-Qaeda...
Do you know better than I?
No, but I don't know that they didn't know. And I think perhaps this is at least as precise as U.S. precision bombing.
They didn't hit World Trade Center 7. Even if they knew, let's assume your invented story about them knowing. Somehow they knew, but nobody else did.
That's not an invented story. I said I don't know.
But they didn't hit World Trade Center 7, sir, so it makes no sense. You offer, the point I'm making is you offer these assertions. You offer them as fact. You have young college students who for many years believed this stuff. And it's only when you're held to account that people start to see you don't know what you're talking about on a lot of these issues.
I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know that that was at least as precise as U.S. precision bombing.
That's a dodge. You claimed they targeted it.
No, that's a fact is what that happens to be.
You claimed they targeted it because the CIA was there and that made it fair game. A, there's no evidence they knew that the CIA was in there. In fact, the evidence is to the contrary, that no one knew. And B, they didn't target World Trade Center 7. They got the first and the second towers. That tower came down afterward, thanks to debris.
That perhaps is the way they got at it. It is at least as accurate as U.S. precision bombing, where the bombs fell quite often as much as 3 miles from the designated target.
Are you writing a textbook?
I hope so.
Are you in the process?
I'm always writing, whether it turns out to be a textbook or not.
But a textbook? I mean, is there a university that is still in the market for Ward Churchill's thoughts?
There's universities all over the country that are in the market for Ward Churchill's thoughts.
Via text, as an instruction manual for students?
Assigned readings count as text, I would suppose. I've not written a textbook per se. Don't know that I will. Think that I might at some point, in any case.
Is it true that you believe we may get more attacks that resemble the 9/11 attacks, and we deserve them?
Well, given my experience and misery in airports ever since 9/11, I would assume that I'm not the only one that thinks we might get more attacks.
And that we deserve them?
You keep doing what you're doing, you're probably going to get responded to in kind. There's a sort of a symmetry to it. I don't know. There's a fair amount of damage inflicted, collateral damage inflicted by drone attacks. That's a little easier to put under the radar. People don't tend to hear about that here, but people tend to hear about it in areas where the drone attacks are occurring, and they're occurring at fairly high degree of frequency, and the toll is pretty high, and I would imagine that's upsetting people, don't you?
Do you believe the United States ought to be bombed?
I think the United States, by its own rules, is subject to being bombed.
You can't answer the question.
Yeah, I have answered the question. I think the United States should comply with law. If it does not comply with law, it opens itself up to it, bombing that is. It opens itself up to having done to it everything it does to anyone else.
Just answer honestly, yes or no. Do we deserve to be bombed? Just say it if you think it's true.
I say that if you open yourself up under rule of law for reciprocation in kind, it's quite likely going to happen. I will say that at that point, no more than a murderer who's convicted and punished, you have no complaint. That's what I say.
Let me know what you think. Go to facebook.com/The Kelly File or send me a tweet at